I'm sorry, Claire Bennett said, keeping her voice low so it would not carry past the display case. I need to cancel the order for tomorrow. The woman behind the counter at Sweetleaf Bakery paused with her pen above the ledger. The lavender cake? The one with the sugared pearls? That one. Claire's hand tightened around the strap of her bag. I know it's short notice. Is everything all right? Claire glanced toward the window, where the late morning light fell in a pale gold stripe across the tile floor. My grandmother needs her heart medication refilled. It's expensive this month. I need the deposit back more than I need a cake. The clerk nodded without judgment, the way people who worked behind counters learned to do, and reached for the register. Neither of them noticed the man standing near the door, half turned toward a rack of bread, who had gone very still. Julian Ashworth had walked into Sweetleaf Bakery that Saturday morning, the way he walked into most rooms in Millstone Harbor, Rhode Island, without expecting to be moved by anything in it. He came often, though he rarely ate what he ordered. Most of what he purchased ended up at formal dinners in the great dining hall of Ashworth Manor, on the bluff above town, where senators and shipping magnates and old harbor families came to shake his hand and admire the view. He was 42, according to every document that mattered. People in Millstone Harbor knew him as the owner of Ashworth Coastal Properties, the largest real estate company on that stretch of the New England shoreline. They knew his white hair, his skin, the color of the moon on still water, his quiet voice, and his habit of leaving early whenever the afternoon sun grew bright. What they did not know, what almost no living person knew, was that Julian had been walking through the world for more than 600 years. To a very small circle, he was not merely wealthy. He was a king, the last ruler of a bloodline that had learned to survive by disappearing into the crowd of ordinary lives around it. He had grown skilled at vanishing in plain sight. He changed his paperwork every few decades, avoided being photographed too often, and kept most people at a careful distance, because humans grew old and humans left, and Julian had learned centuries ago that loving them usually meant, eventually, watching an empty chair. He should have left the bakery the moment he understood the conversation was not meant for him. It was a private matter, a woman's private arithmetic between medicine and celebration, and he had spent a very long life training himself not to interfere in problems that did not belong to him. And yet his feet did not move toward the door. Instead, he watched the clerk count bills back into Claire's palm, watched Claire fold them into a wallet that had clearly been repaired more than once, and felt something old and half-forgotten stir somewhere beneath his ribs. He remembered his own mother, in a kitchen so far in the past that the language spoken in it no longer existed anywhere on earth, mixing batter by hand because buying a cake in the village square had cost more than the family could spare. As a boy, he had believed she simply preferred to bake. He understood now, watching a stranger count coins in a bakery 6 centuries later, that preference had very little to do with it. Before he could talk himself out of it, Julian crossed the small shop and stopped a respectful distance from her. "Excuse me," he said. Claire turned, and something in her posture shifted, a small protective straightening, though there was no one behind her to protect. "Yes? My name is Julian. I couldn't help overhearing part of your conversation." That usually means someone was listening rather hard. He allowed himself something close to a smile. "That's fair." She waited, arms folding. "I'd like to cover the cost of the cake," he said. "Consider it paid." "No." The refusal came so fast that even the clerk looked up. Julian inclined his head. "All right, may I ask why? You can ask." "Why not?" Claire exhaled through her nose. "Because I don't know you, and because charity from strangers usually comes with strings I can't see yet. That's a reasonable policy." He considered her for a moment, the tired set of her shoulders, the deliberate calm in her voice that suggested she had practiced staying calm in front of far worse than an odd man in a bakery. "I grew up with less than people assume, looking at me now. My mother baked every cake in our house because a bought one wasn't something we could afford. I spent a long time afterward, pretending that part of my life had never happened. I would rather not do that today." Something in Claire's face loosened, just slightly, the way ice loosens before it breaks. "I don't take charity," she said again, quieter this time. "Then call it a loan," Julian said. "You may repay it whenever it's convenient. I have no need of the money, and considerably less need of your gratitude." She studied him for a long moment, the way a person studies a stranger they suspect they will regret trusting. Then she looked past him toward the cake in the glass case, the pale lavender frosting and the small sugared pearls arranged like a strand of tiny moons. "It's for my grandmother's 80th birthday," she said finally. "She raised me. I wanted just once, to give her something she didn't have to ration." Then let it happen, Julian said. Let me be the excuse if you need one. Tell her a customer at your register insisted. Claire almost laughed, a short surprised sound that seemed to catch her off guard as much as him. I work at Dawson's Market. Nobody insists on anything there except the express lane rules. Then tell her whatever story you like. I only ask that the cake gets made. She was quiet long enough that the clerk shifted her weight, waiting. Then Claire reached into her bag and produced a worn business card of her own, the kind printed cheaply at a copy shop, and set it on the counter beside the ledger. If I take this, she said, I want your number so I can pay you back on a schedule, in writing. I don't want to owe a stranger something with no shape to it. That seems fair, Julian said, and gave her his card in return, plain cream stock with only his name and a private line printed on it. No company, crest, no title. I'm Julian Ashworth. Claire Bennett. She looked at the card a moment longer than necessary. Thank you, Mr. Ashworth. Julian is fine. The clerk restored the order to the ledger, and Julian, before he could reconsider it, added a box of cookies and a dozen small tea cakes to the counter as well. Claire's eyebrows rose. That wasn't part of the agreement, she said. Birthdays deserve more than one item, Julian said simply, and did not explain further, because he was not entirely sure he could have. He paid before she could argue, thanked the clerk, and stepped back out into the cold, bright morning, leaving Claire Bennett standing at the counter with a card in her hand and an expression he could not quite name. He did not look back through the window. He did not need to. Something in him had already turned, quietly and without his permission, toward a direction he had spent centuries training himself to avoid. Julian returned to Ashworth Manor a little before noon. The estate stood beyond the edge of Millstone Harbor proper, where the coast road narrowed and climbed through stands of old pine before opening onto a bluff with a view of gray water in every direction. Parts of the house had been rebuilt more than once over the centuries, wings added and removed as fashions and fortunes shifted, but the foundation stones beneath the eastern cellar had been laid by Julian's own hands long before the country around them had taken its current shape or name. Marcus Hale met him in the entrance hall, as he nearly always did, dressed with the quiet precision of a man who had spent almost 2 decades learning exactly how much formality his employer actually wanted. Marcus was one of only a handful of living people who knew what Julian truly was, and one of even fewer who had never once flinched at the knowledge. You were gone longer than usual, Marcus observed, taking in the bakery boxes under Julian's arm. There was a delay, a significant one from the look of that box. Julian set the boxes on the hall table without comment. Cancel tonight's dinner, he said. The senator's office confirmed the arrangement yesterday. Marcus's eyebrows lifted a fraction, the closest he ever came to open surprise. You haven't canceled one of those dinners in longer than I can remember. Tell them something came up. What came up exactly? Julian thought of a lavender cake with sugared pearls, and a woman who refused a stranger's charity until he gave her a reason to accept it that did not feel like charity at all. I changed my mind about how I wanted to spend the evening. Should I mark the date? Marcus asked, dry enough that it might have passed for a joke, though Julian suspected it was not entirely one. Mark it, Julian said, and went upstairs without further explanation, leaving Marcus to make the necessary calls. The house was quiet again within the hour. The particular silence Julian had once found restful, and now more and more found difficult to distinguish from emptiness. He stood at the window of his study for a long while, looking out over the water, turning Claire Bennett's business card over between 2 fingers. It listed only her name and a phone number, nothing else, printed slightly crooked, as though the copy shop machine had been running low on toner. He set it on his desk, in the drawer, where he kept nothing else of any real importance, and told himself he would likely never use it. 3 days later, his private line rang from a number he did not recognize. He rarely answered calls from unfamiliar numbers. That afternoon, for reasons he chose not to examine too closely, he did. Hello, Mr. Ashworth. He recognized the voice before she finished the sentence. Julian is fine, he said again. This is Claire Bennett, from the bakery, I remember. I wanted to thank you properly. The party was on Sunday. My grandmother loved the cake more than I think I've ever seen her love anything that came out of a box. I'm glad to hear it. There was frosting in places frosting had no business being, Claire said, and he could hear the smile in it now, faint but real. My grandmother is 80 years old, and she still managed to get lavender icing on the ceiling fan. Julian found himself laughing, a low, unfamiliar sound in the quiet of his study. That sounds like a successful party. It was. A short pause followed, the kind that suggested she was deciding something. I want to talk about paying you back. Properly, on a schedule, like we agreed. You don't have to rush that conversation. I'd rather not owe anyone something without a shape to it, remember? She said. There's a coffee shop near the public library. Would tomorrow afternoon work? He answered before he had fully considered it. Yes. After the call ended, Julian remained at his desk long after the light outside had faded into evening, turning the shape of the coming afternoon over in his mind the way he might once have turned over the terms of a treaty. He was not a man given to nervousness. He had negotiated with kings whose names history had since forgotten, had stood in rooms where a wrong word meant a burned village rather than a lost contract, and had learned, over centuries, to keep his voice level regardless of what sat behind it. And yet the prospect of an ordinary cup of coffee with a cashier from Dawson's Market unsettled him in a way none of that ever had. He walked the grounds of the manor that night instead of sleeping past the old stone wall that marked the edge of the property, down toward the water where the tide moved in slow, patient sheets against the rocks. He thought of the handful of times across 6 centuries he had allowed himself to care for someone fully, knowing even as he did it how the story would end. A woman in a plague year who had begged him to save her, and whom he could not. A soldier's widow 200 years later who had guessed what he was and loved him anyway, for the 11 years fate allowed her. Each time he had told himself afterward that the grief was not worth repeating, that the wiser course was distance, politeness, a life conducted at arm's length from anyone who might one day leave an empty chair behind. He had believed that, mostly, for a very long time. Standing at the edge of the water that night, he was no longer entirely certain he still did. The next afternoon, Julian arrived at the coffee shop wearing jeans, a plain dark sweater, and an ordinary wool coat instead of anything tailored. Claire was already seated at a corner table when he came in, and she looked up with visible surprise. "You look different," she said. "Different bad, or different normal?" "Less like a man who owns half the waterfront," Claire said. "More like someone who might actually know how to use a washing machine." "I can use a washing machine," Julian said, sitting across from her. "I simply prefer not to advertise it." They ordered coffee and a plate of pastries neither of them finished. Claire set a folded sheet of paper on the table between them, lines of careful handwriting covering both sides. "A payment schedule," she explained when he opened it. "Small enough that it'll take a while, but I'll get there." "You actually calculated this." "I said it was a loan. Loans have terms." Julian studied the paper a moment longer than it required, mostly to give himself something to do with his hands. "What do you do when you're not planning repayment schedules for strangers?" "I work the register at Dawson's Market, have for 6 years. "And who else is in your life, besides your grandmother?" "Just us," Claire said. "My parents died when I was young, in a car accident on the coast road, actually. Not far from here. My grandmother Ruth raised me after that. She's about the only family I've got, and lately she's the only family I need." She said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, the way people say things they have long since made peace with. Julian recognized the tone. He had used it himself in other centuries, about other losses. "I'm sorry," he said anyway. "It was a long time ago." Claire wrapped both hands around her cup. "What about you? You said you grew up without much." Julian had been asked about his fortune more times than he could number. Almost no one asked about the years before it. "My father worked long hours at the docks. My mother cleaned houses on the hill above the harbor where I grew up, in a town very far from here. I worked while I studied and eventually bought my first small piece of property and built from there." He left out the centuries. He left out the crown that had once, in a stone hall now buried beneath the sea, been placed on his head by people who no longer had names anyone remembered. Everything he told her about loneliness, though, was entirely true. "And now?" Claire asked. "What does a day look like for you now?" "Now I spend most of my time making sure buildings earn slightly more money than they did yesterday." "That sounds unbearably boring." "It is," Julian admitted, and something in him relaxed at finally saying so out loud. "Then why do it?" No investor, no board member, no politician at any of his careful dinners had ever asked him that question so plainly. "I'm not entirely sure anymore," he said, and meant it. They stayed until the shop began stacking chairs around them, well past the hour either of them had intended. When they finally stood to leave, Claire pulled on her coat and looked at him with an expression that had softened considerably since she'd walked in. "Thank you for not treating me like a project," she said. "You're not one," Julian said. She turned toward the door, then paused. "Would you want to do this again? So we can go over the next payment." "No," Julian said, and watched her face fall for half a second before he continued. "I'd rather we talk about something other than money next time." Claire considered that long enough to make him genuinely uncertain of her answer. Then she smiled. Small and real. I'd like that. One coffee became another, and then a third. On the third occasion, Claire suggested the old bookshop on Harbor Street instead, a narrow, crowded place that smelled of dust and salt air, run by a man who seemed to know the location of every volume without consulting a single list. Julian found himself drawn, without quite meaning to, toward a shelf of local histories, and Claire caught him running a finger along the spines with an odd, private expression. You look like you're checking whether they got something wrong, she said. Sometimes they do, Julian admitted, sliding a slim volume about the founding of Millstone Harbor back into place. Not maliciously. Memory simply erodes, the way coastline does. Someone writes a house was built in a certain year, and it's off by a decade, and no one left alive remembers well enough to correct it. Does that bother you? Less than it used to. I've come to think there's a kind of mercy in it. Not everything needs to be remembered perfectly to have mattered. He selected a different book, a slim collection of harbor photographs from the previous century, and held it out to her. Though I confess I enjoy correcting the errors when I happen to know the truth. Claire took the book, flipping through grainy black and white images of fishing boats and stern-faced dock workers. Tell me one, an error. He pointed to a photograph captioned as showing the harbor's original lighthouse keeper. That isn't the keeper, that's his assistant. The keeper refused to be photographed his entire life, considered it bad luck, and no one bothered correcting the record once he was gone. How do you know that? I bought him his last round of whiskey at the tavern that used to stand where the bank is now, Julian said, and Claire laughed so suddenly that the bookshop's owner glanced over with mild alarm. Within a few weeks, Julian knew which evenings Claire worked the closing shift at Dawson's Market, and which mornings she stopped first at her grandmother's apartment to check on her before her shift began. Claire, in turn, learned that Julian disliked crowded restaurants, that he left most formal events before dessert was served, and that he had an unexpectedly dry sense of humor that surfaced only once he had decided a person was safe to be himself around. One Sunday afternoon, they sat on a bench near the public gardens by the harbor, watching gulls argue over a dropped sandwich crust. You're strange for a wealthy man, Claire said. How many wealthy men do you actually know? One. Then your research methods leave something to be desired. Claire laughed, and the sound of it settled into him the way sunlight settles into stone, slow and warm, and entirely unwelcome in a life he had built to avoid exactly this kind of warmth. A few weeks after that, Claire invited him to dinner at the small apartment she shared with her grandmother, 2 floors above a hardware store on Chestnut Street. It won't be fancy, she warned him over the phone. Good, Julian said. I attend far too many fancy dinners already. Ruth Bennett opened the door before Claire could reach it, a small woman with silver hair pinned back and a wooden spoon still in one hand, as though she had simply walked away from the stove mid-stir to answer the bell. So you're the cake man, Ruth said, looking Julian up and down with the frank appraisal of someone who had long since stopped worrying about being polite for its own sake. He bought the cake, Grandma, Claire called from somewhere behind her. You're pale, Ruth said, still studying him. Do you eat enough? I hear that often, Julian said. Come inside then. We'll fix that tonight. Dinner was simple, roasted vegetables and fresh bread, and a soup Ruth had clearly spent the afternoon on, despite insisting it was nothing special. Julian could eat human food well enough, though it gave him little in the way of real sustenance, and 6 centuries of practice had made the pretense easy. Ruth asked questions without any hesitation at all. Were you married? She asked, partway through the meal. Once, Julian said, a very long time ago. Children? A daughter. Where is she now? Julian set down his spoon. We aren't close, it's a long story, and mostly my fault. Ruth nodded once, without judgment. That happens to people. No shame in saying so plainly. Ruth reached for the bread basket, passing it to him without being asked. My husband and I lost touch with his brother for almost 15 years, over something so small I can't even remember what started it anymore. By the time we mended it, he had maybe 2 good years left in him. I've always regretted not fixing it sooner. I think about that more than I'd like to admit, Julian said quietly. Then don't wait for a reason that feels big enough, Ruth said. The reason is rarely big. It's just time, running out quietly in the background while you're busy being proud. And then, mercifully, she moved on to another subject, asking after his opinion of the soup, though Julian noticed she filed the earlier answer away rather than forgetting it, the way she seemed to file away everything worth remembering. After dinner, Claire walked him down to the street. You survived, she said. Does your grandmother interrogate every guest that thoroughly? Only the ones she's decided are worth the trouble. Julian glanced back up at the lit window of the apartment. I like her. She likes you too. How can you tell? She offered you a second bowl of soup, Claire said. That's the highest honor in this household. An honor then, Julian said, and found that he meant it more than he had meant almost anything in a very long time. Over the following 2 months hence, Julian spent less and less time at the fundraisers and dinners that had once filled his calendar, and considerably more time at Chestnut Street or wherever else Claire happened to be. Marcus eventually confronted him about it in the study, tablet in hand, several missed appearances stacked up behind him like unpaid bills. You declined another gala, Marcus said. I did. Is this about Claire Bennett? It is. Marcus lowered the tablet. Does she know what you are? Not yet. That will eventually become a problem, Julian. People notice sooner or later when someone around them doesn't age. We've known each other for months, Julian said, not decades. I have spent centuries thinking ahead of every conversation before I've had it. For once, I would like to simply think about now. Marcus said nothing further, though the look on his face suggested the conversation was not truly finished, only postponed. That same week, Julian stopped by Dawson's Market on a pretense of needing groceries he had no real use for. He found Claire at the service counter, patiently helping an elderly customer sort out a billing error on his account, checking the receipt twice, finding the mistake, and correcting it without once making the man feel foolish for having missed it himself. When the customer left, visibly relieved, Julian approached the counter. Are you following me now? Claire asked, though she was smiling. I needed groceries. She glanced at his empty hands. For your invisible refrigerator? I have a job opening you might consider, Julian said. Her smile faded slightly. Julian, hear it before you decide anything. He explained that Ashworth Coastal Properties needed someone in client relations. Someone who could sit across from anxious tenants and worried buyers and actually listen before responding. You handled difficult, confused, and frightened people all day, every day, he said. You remember names. You listen before you speak. A great many people at my company have never learned to do either. I don't have a college degree. The position doesn't require one. I know nothing about real estate. You'll learn it. Everyone does eventually. Claire narrowed her eyes. What's the salary? He told her. She stared at him for a long moment. That's nearly 4 times what I make here. I'm aware. Then this is Charity wearing a business suit. It isn't. You'll interview with a department manager who is not me, and who has no idea we know each other beyond a professional introduction. If they don't hire you, I won't intervene. Really. A week later, the department manager hired her without any involvement from Julian at all, impressed enough by the interview that she mentioned it twice in her hiring recommendation. Claire's first week was harder than she let on to anyone, including Julian. The office moved at a different pace than the register at Dawson's Market, full of unfamiliar acronyms and lease terms she had to look up twice before she understood them. On her 3rd day, an elderly tenant named Mr. Castellano called in furious, convinced the company was raising his rent illegally, his voice climbing before Claire had said more than her name. Rather than transfer him or read from a script, she stayed on the line for nearly 40 minutes, pulled his file herself, found the clerical error that had triggered the increase, and walked him through the correction slowly enough that he thanked her twice before hanging up. Her supervisor, passing by afterward, asked how she'd known to check the file herself instead of escalating the call. At the market, Claire said, if you can't fix a customer's problem yourself, they usually give up on getting it fixed at all. So I got in the habit of just fixing it. Word of the call reached Julian by the end of the day, secondhand, through a supervisor who had no idea he already knew her, and he found himself absurdly, quietly proud, in a way that had nothing to do with the company's numbers at all. 6 months after the bakery, Claire no longer checked every grocery price twice before setting it in her cart. She had not become wealthy, but she had paid down Ruth's medical bills, replaced a washing machine that had been failing for over a year, and started a modest savings account for the first time in her adult life. At Ashworth Coastal Properties, she became popular quickly, treating every client the way she had treated confused shoppers at Dawson's Market, like people rather than numbers on a lease agreement. She grew close, too, with a woman named Priya Nair from the leasing office, who had a habit of appearing at Claire's desk exactly when a difficult call ended, holding 2 cups of tea and demanding a full account of whatever had just happened. You're seeing him for real, then, Priya said one afternoon, setting a cup down without asking whether Claire wanted one. Julian Ashworth, not just coffee with a stranger who paid for cake anymore. Define real. He rearranged the entire executive schedule around a staffing test you proposed in a meeting. That's not a small thing, Claire. Men like that don't rearrange anything for anyone. He rearranged it because I was right, Claire said, though she was smiling into her tea. Sure. That's exactly what I said about my ex-husband's promises, right before none of them held up. Priya's tone was light, but something more serious moved underneath it. I'm not warning you off him. I like the way you talk about him, actually. I've just watched you carry your grandmother's medical bills alone for 6 years without complaining once, and I'd rather see somebody take care of you for a change instead of the other way around. He does, Claire admitted. It still feels strange to say out loud. Get used to saying it, Priya said. You've earned the practice. She also disagreed with Julian in meetings, which almost no other employee ever dared to do. One afternoon, he suggested closing the client desk earlier on Fridays, citing a report showing calls dropped sharply after 4 in the afternoon. Claire shook her head before he had finished the sentence. That's exactly when working families call, she said. After their shifts end. Our data says otherwise. Your data only counts the calls that get answered. It doesn't count the people who tried twice, got nothing, and gave up. The room went quiet around the conference table. Julian looked from Claire to the rest of the assembled staff, none of whom met his eyes. Test the idea for 1 month, he said finally. Full staffing through 6 in the evening. We'll look at the numbers after. Later, Claire caught him near the elevator. You didn't have to agree with me. I didn't agree with you. I agreed to find out whether you were right. And if you're wrong, then I expect you'll remind me, Julian said, and she laughed, and something in his chest turned over slowly, like a key finding the right lock after centuries of trying the wrong ones. Their friendship shifted, gradually, and then all at once. Julian found himself inventing reasons to stay near her longer than any single conversation required. Claire began bringing him coffee he barely drank, simply because bringing it had become a habit neither of them examined too closely. Ruth started setting a third plate at dinner without being asked. One evening they walked the length of the harbor path together, past the fishing boats tied up for the night and the old lighthouse that had stood at the point for longer than the town itself had a name. Claire asked, out of nowhere, whether it frightened him, watching people he cared about grow old while he stayed exactly as he was. Every time, Julian admitted. It doesn't become easier with practice, whatever people assume. If anything, it becomes harder because you know precisely what's coming and precisely how much it will cost. Then why do it at all? Why let yourself get close to anyone? He considered the question seriously, watching the lighthouse beam sweep slowly across the water. For a long time, I told myself the answer was that I shouldn't. That distance was simply the wiser policy for someone in my position. But a life spent avoiding loss isn't actually a life spent avoiding pain. It's a life spent in a different, quieter kind of pain, one nobody else can see because there's no funeral for it, no name for what's missing. I chose that version for centuries and called it wisdom. He glanced at her. I'm no longer convinced it was wisdom at all. Claire slipped her hand into his. That's a very long way of saying you'd rather be sad about something than empty about everything. You have a talent for saying in one sentence what takes me several paragraphs. It's a gift, she said, and they walked the rest of the way to her building in comfortable silence, the tide moving steadily against the rocks below. In late September, Julian invited Claire to a fundraiser he could not politely decline, a formal evening at the Millstone Harbor Yacht Club meant to benefit the Coastal Preservation Society. He had attended 100 nearly identical evenings without a single companion, and found himself, for the first time in decades, wanting one particular person beside him rather than simply enduring the room alone. Claire wore a dress she had borrowed from Priya and spent most of the drive over insisting she would say something wrong to somebody important. She did not. She spoke easily with an elderly harbor commissioner about the price of dock permits, charmed a notoriously difficult donor by admitting outright that she had no idea what a hedge fund actually did, and drew Julian quietly aside near the terrace doors when the room grew too loud for comfort. Everyone keeps looking at me like I wandered in from the wrong party, she murmured. They're looking at you because you're the first person I've brought to one of these evenings in longer than most of them can remember, Julian said. The novelty will pass. Will it? Eventually. Possibly around the time they realize you're the only interesting conversation in the room. A woman in a pale green gown approached them before Claire could respond. Silver hair swept into an elegant knot, her smile a fraction too practiced. Julian, she said, you've been positively invisible this season. Diane, Julian said, with the careful neutrality of a man who had once been married to the person now addressing him. This is Claire Bennett. Diane's gaze moved over Claire with the swift, cataloging assessment of someone accustomed to sizing up a room in a single glance. How lovely, she said in a tone that suggested the opposite. Sophie mentioned you'd found someone new. Claire and I appreciate you not making this evening more complicated than it needs to be, Julian said evenly. I wouldn't dream of it, Diane said, and drifted away toward the bar, leaving a faint chill behind her that even the warm evening couldn't entirely dispel. That was your ex-wife, Claire said, once she was out of earshot. That was my ex-wife. She doesn't like me very much. She doesn't know you at all, Julian said, which, historically, has never stopped her from forming an opinion. Claire laughed despite herself, and the tension in her shoulders eased. I can live with that. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday evening in early autumn, something happened that Julian could not easily explain away. He had come to Chestnut Street to walk Claire home from a late shift and found Ruth waiting on the front step for them, wanting fresh air after a long day indoors. She was descending the 2 low steps to the sidewalk when her cane caught on an uneven paving stone. She pitched forward, arms out, too far gone to catch herself. Julian moved before he had decided to move at all. One instant he was several strides away, near the base of the steps. The next he was beside Ruth, one arm already braced beneath her shoulders, easing her weight down onto the step rather than the pavement. It happened in less time than a human eye could properly track. Claire, who had been half a step behind her grandmother, froze where she stood. I'm fine, Ruth said, patting Julian's arm, entirely unbothered, already more concerned with her dignity than her balance. Clumsy old woman, that's all. Julian helped her the rest of the way down and settled her onto a bench near the door, checking her wrist and hip with careful, unhurried hands, the way anyone attentive might. But Claire had not moved. She stood on the step above them, staring at him. How did you get to her that fast, she asked, once Ruth had gone inside to fetch a glass of water, muttering about paving stones the whole way. I was close by. Julian. I was standing right next to her. You were still by the gate, he said nothing. That wasn't normal, Claire said quietly. That wasn't anything close to normal. Julian had deceived senators, judges, physicians, and entire governments across 6 centuries without a single misstep. He found, standing on a cracked sidewalk on Chestnut Street, that he could not manage to deceive her. Come to the manor tomorrow evening, he said. I'll explain everything. All of it. Why not now? Because what I have to tell you deserves more than a doorstep, and because I would like, for once, to say it somewhere I can't run from the look on your face. The next evening, rain moved in off the water and struck the tall windows of the manor's private library in long, uneven sheets. Claire stood near the shelves with her arms crossed, watching Julian unlock a cabinet she had never noticed before, tucked between 2 rows of leather-bound books. Inside were photographs and paintings, some clearly recent, others faded and cracked with an age that made no immediate sense. Claire lifted one photograph, black and white, the edges soft with wear. The man in it had Julian's exact face, same white hair, same pale skin, same quiet, watchful eyes. She set it down slowly. What is this? That's me. That can't be you. This photograph is over 100 years old. I know. Is it altered somehow? A trick? No trick. Julian said, sit down if you'd like, or don't, but let me explain. Claire did not sit. Explain then. My family isn't entirely human, Julian said. The old stories call people like us vampires. For several long seconds, only the rain filled the room. Then Claire gave a short, disbelieving laugh. You're serious. I am. You expect me to believe that. I expect you to believe what you saw on the sidewalk yesterday, and to let me explain the rest of it honestly, rather than let you keep guessing. She was quiet a moment. Do you drink blood? Julian hesitated only slightly. Animal blood and donated medical blood that would otherwise be discarded. Never from anyone unwilling, and never from anyone at all, if I can help it. That's not exactly reassuring. I know. What about sunlight? Uncomfortable, in strong doses. Not deadly, contrary to most of what's written about us. Garlic? Mostly just unpleasant breath, and only for the person who ate it. Despite herself, the corner of Claire's mouth twitched, though her eyes stayed serious. How old are you? Actually, older than I look, considerably. How much older? Julian answered quietly, without softening it. More than 600 years. He watched the number land on her the way it always seemed to land on anyone told it plainly, as an abstraction too large to hold, and found himself unusually wanting to make it smaller and more real. I was born in a coastal village that no longer exists, in a kingdom whose borders were redrawn so many times afterward that most maps don't bother naming it anymore, he said. My family had ruled there for generations before the change came, the one that made us what we are now. I've watched languages die and get reborn as something else entirely. I've watched the shape of this very coastline shift, with the tides across centuries. Watched towns rise where there was only marsh. Watched other towns sink back into the sea. Being a king of anything, in the end, mattered far less than simply enduring long enough to remember it all. Most of what I carry isn't power. It's memory, and a great deal of it is heavier than I would ever wish on anyone I loved. Claire sat down heavily in the nearest chair. That's a lot to sit with. I understand if you need time. And Marcus called you a king once, she said suddenly, months ago in passing when he thought I wasn't listening closely. Julian closed his eyes briefly. I owe Marcus a conversation about discretion. So it's true, all of it. Yes. Claire stood, gathering her coat from the chair beside her. I need to go home. I understand, Julian said. I won't follow you. I know you won't. She reached the door and paused there, hand on the frame, not quite looking back at him. Was any of it real? Everything you told me about yourself, your childhood, your mother baking, everything that mattered was real, Julian said without hesitation. My childhood happened even if it happened a very long time ago. My mother was real. Losing people, over and over across centuries, was real. And what's grown between us has been the realest thing I've felt in longer than I can properly measure. Claire left without answering. She did not call the next day, or the day after that. Julian did not reach out either, holding to the promise he had made her on the doorstep, though the silence sat in the manor like something physical, a weight in every empty room. On the fourth evening, Marcus found him still at his desk, papers untouched in front of him. You look terrible, Marcus observed. I'm immortal, Marcus, not immune to feeling terrible. I told her I assumed as much. Marcus set a folder down. For what it's worth, she came into the office today, argued for 20 minutes about the Friday staffing schedule with the operations director, apparently with her usual conviction. Julian looked up. If she intended to disappear from your life entirely, Marcus said, I doubt she'd have spent her lunch hour defending a scheduling policy she has no personal stake in anymore. That evening, Claire knocked on the door of Julian's office rather than the manor, still in her work clothes, hair coming loose from its clip. I have questions, she said before he could speak. Ask anything. Can you read minds? No. Control them? No. Do you sleep in some kind of coffin? I sleep in a bed like anyone else, in a room with heavy curtains. Why are you smiling right now? Because Marcus asked me nearly the same question years ago and looked equally disappointed by the answer. Claire sat down across from him. Do you age at all? Very slowly, sometimes barely at all, across a decade. So in 20 years you'll look almost exactly like you do now. Yes, and I won't. Julian's smile faded. No, you won't. Claire looked away, toward the dark window. That's what frightened you most, isn't it? Not the blood, not any of it. That part. Yes, he admitted. Why did you keep seeing me, knowing that was always waiting at the end of it? He could have avoided the question, could have offered something easier. He chose not to. Because being near you made my life feel like something I was living, rather than something I was only watching pass by. Claire looked at him for a long moment. That's a very romantic thing to say for someone who claims he doesn't talk much. I've had 600 years to practice. Apparently none of it prepared me for you, specifically. She laughed then, quiet and a little wet around the edges, and something in the room finally loosened. Claire told Priya everything the following week, over lunch in the break room, watching her friend's face for some sign of alarm that never quite arrived. So he's genuinely 600 years old, Priya said slowly, setting down her sandwich, give or take. And you're still, what, considering this? Dating him, knowing exactly how it ends? I don't know how it ends, Claire said. Nobody does, not really. I just have slightly more specific information than most people about the shape of it. Priya was quiet for a moment, turning that over. My grandmother used to say that the two of us are all promised the same thing eventually, just not the same schedule. I always thought that was a strange way to comfort someone, but sitting here, listening to you, I think I finally understand what she meant. You're not going to tell me I'm being reckless? I watched you carry your grandmother's medical bills alone for 6 years and never once complain, Priya said. I think you've already proven you're capable of loving something difficult without flinching from the cost of it. This doesn't seem so different, honestly. Just a longer timeline and a much better dental plan. Claire laughed, grateful for the joke, grateful even more for the absence of the warning she had half expected. Thank you, she said, for not making this stranger than it already is. Somebody has to be normal about the vampire thing, Priya said. Might as well be me. After that, things settled into a new, strange, entirely manageable rhythm. Sometimes Claire forgot, for whole stretches of an evening, what Julian truly was. Then she would notice him keeping carefully to the shade of a doorway, or declining lunch outdoors on a bright afternoon, and remember all over again. One evening, she walked into the small kitchen at the manor and found him holding a sealed medical blood pouch, warming it carefully between his palms. Julian froze. Claire stared, then set down the grocery bag she was carrying. So that's dinner. I was hoping this could remain slightly less embarrassing than it currently is. Is it safe, legal? Both. Fine. She opened the refrigerator and pulled out a container of yogurt for herself. Your dinner still looks considerably worse than mine. Julian laughed, and the sound of it filled the kitchen in a way that surprised them both. Not long after, Julian learned that Ruth had known far longer than either of them suspected. He had gone to Chestnut Street alone one evening, while Claire worked a late shift, mostly to check on Ruth as had become his habit. She asked him to sit beside her at the small kitchen table. You love her, Ruth said. It was not a question. Yes, good. She studied him with sharp, unclouded eyes. You're still very pale, you know, Julian managed a small laugh. That won't be improving. I know, Ruth said simply. He went still. How long have you known? Since the first dinner you had here. You ate 3 bites of soup and spent the rest of the meal moving food around your plate very convincingly. I raised a granddaughter and buried a husband. I notice things. Does Claire know that you know? No. I saw no reason to frighten her before she was ready to hear it from you. Ruth reached across the table and took his cold hand in both of her warm ones, entirely unafraid. Whatever you are, you've been kind to my family. That matters more to me than what name the old stories give you. Julian looked down at their joined hands. Thank you. Don't thank me. Promise me something instead. Her grip tightened slightly. Stay when things get difficult. They will, eventually, everything does. I will, Julian said. Don't promise me, Ruth said, glancing toward the front door, where she could hear Claire's key already turning in the lock. Promise her. Julian nodded, throat tight in a way he had not expected. I already have, he said, in every way I know how. Keeping Julian's true nature hidden had always been easier than keeping his relationship with Claire hidden. Millstone Harbor's wealthiest families had watched him for years, speculating quietly over which heiress or executive he might eventually settle down with. Nobody had expected Claire Bennett, a cashier from Dawson's Market with a repaired coat sleeve, and no family name anyone recognized. The first photograph appeared online after someone spotted them leaving a small restaurant near the harbor, arm in arm. The headline described Claire as a former grocery store cashier who had somehow captured the attention of the reclusive real estate billionaire Julian Ashworth. Claire read it over his shoulder, jaw tight. Captured, she said. I sound like an escaped animal. It gets worse from there, Julian admitted, scrolling further. Other articles questioned how she had obtained her position at Ashworth Coastal Properties, implying, wrongly, that she had engineered their meeting from the start. Marcus moved quickly to correct the record wherever he reasonably could, though correcting an eager rumor mill proved slower and more exhausting than either of them expected. The board of Ashworth Coastal Properties called an emergency session that Julian attended alone at his own insistence so that Claire would not have to sit through it. Several of the older members, men who had served on the board since before Julian had bought his first controlling share, spoke carefully around the actual subject, using words like optics and shareholder confidence, rather than saying plainly what they meant. The concern, said one director, a silver-templed man named Harold Voss, who had known Julian for nearly 30 years without ever once suspecting what he truly was, is simply that Miss Bennett's background differs considerably from what our investors are accustomed to seeing associated with the Ashworth name. Miss Bennett's background, Julian said, in a voice that made 2 junior board members suddenly very interested in their own notepads, includes 6 years of exemplary work at a grocery store, followed by 8 months turning around our client relations division more effectively than the consulting firm we paid a small fortune to advise us the year before. If our investors require an apology for that, I'm afraid they'll be waiting a long time. Voss held his gaze a moment, then nodded slowly, the way men do when they have decided a fight isn't worth having. Noted, he said, and the meeting moved on to quarterly earnings, though Julian suspected the matter was far from settled in every mind at that table. For weeks, Claire tried to ignore most of it. Her co-workers largely treated her the same as always, though a few grew noticeably quieter whenever she entered a room. One evening she arrived at the manor and set her bag down on a chair with more force than the moment strictly required. I think we've made a mistake, she said. Julian looked up sharply. What happened? This. She gestured between them, at the space the relationship occupied. I'm making your life harder. Your board is nervous. Reporters are digging through my entire history, like I'm a case file. That will stop, Julian said, jaw tightening. You can't control every newspaper in the state, Julian. I can control enough of them. Claire sat down heavily. Your world doesn't especially want people like me in it. Then my world will have to change its opinion. You can't fix everything by deciding to. I know that, Julian said. Quieter now. And your grandmother, and everyone who matters to you, deserve better than headlines written by people who have never once had to choose between medicine and a birthday cake. He paused. There's something else. My daughter, Sophie. My former wife has apparently been telling her that I've replaced my own family with people I barely know. Claire's face fell. Julian, I don't want to become the reason your daughter resents you even further. You aren't the reason, Julian said. Whatever distance exists between Sophie and me, I built that myself over years of choosing obligation over presence. That isn't something you caused, and it isn't something you can fix by disappearing from my life either. Claire reached across the table, and Julian took her hand. For most of my existence, he said slowly, I made choices based entirely on what other people expected of me. I married because it made political and practical sense at the time. I built companies because money and influence made it easier to protect my secret. I attended dinners I dreaded and kept people close because they were useful, rather than because I loved them. He looked around the vast, half-empty room. I own a house with more bedrooms than I could ever reasonably fill. That is a little ridiculous, Claire said. I agree completely. He met her eyes. I spent centuries protecting a life I didn't particularly enjoy living. Then I walked into a bakery and met a woman who refused a stranger's charity until he gave her a reason that let her keep her dignity intact. I won't let strangers with opinions decide what matters to me now. 2 weeks later, Julian stood before a room full of reporters at Ashworth Coastal Properties' public shareholder meeting. Marcus had expected him to sidestep the inevitable questions about Claire entirely. He did not. Are you and Miss Bennett romantically involved? One reporter asked, near the end of the session. Yes, Julian said. The room grew louder. Another reporter pressed further. Did you arrange her position at your company? No. She interviewed with a department manager, without any involvement from me. I stayed out of that decision entirely, and I would encourage anyone doubting that to review the hiring records themselves. A third reporter asked, more pointedly, whether Julian believed Claire truly fit into his social circle. Julian paused only briefly. No, he said, and the room went quiet, expecting a retraction that never came. I think my social circle should learn to fit into hers. Claire Bennett supported her family through years of difficult months, without complaint, treats every person she meets with the same respect whether they own the building or clean it, and has more integrity than most people I've shared a boardroom with. If anyone believes that makes her unsuitable for my life, I think they've badly misunderstood what kind of life I actually want to lead. The clip spread quickly across the region by that evening. Julian had never much cared for how fast information traveled online. For the first time, he found himself grateful for it. Sophie Ashworth watched the clip late that night, and Julian's private phone rang shortly before midnight. He recognized the number immediately and stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. Sophie. Silence then, finally. Hi, Dad. I saw the interview, she continued when he said nothing further. Mom says Claire is using you for your money. She isn't. Mom says you're giving her family everything, and giving me nothing. I'm trying to be part of their lives, Julian said carefully. That was never meant to come at your expense. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the question he had feared for years. What about mine? What about being part of my life? He did not try to defend himself. I failed you, Sophie. I told myself for a long time that your mother was the one keeping you at a distance. Sometimes she was. But I also let work and old habits become an excuse to stay away, long after I should have stopped hiding behind them. You missed my law school graduation, I know. I sent flowers instead of showing up, which was a coward's substitute, and I've regretted it since. Sophie's voice thickened. I don't even know if I know you anymore. Then let me try to fix that, Julian said. Slowly, if that's what it takes. Why now? Sophie asked quieter. Why is it Claire who gets the version of you I always wanted, and not me? Julian took a long moment before answering, unwilling to offer her anything less than the truth. Because I was afraid with you, in a way I've only recently understood. I watched your mother age while I stayed the same, and some part of me decided, without ever saying it aloud, that the safest thing I could do for you was stay slightly removed, so that whatever eventually happened between your mother and me wouldn't cost you as much. I told myself it was protection. Looking back, it was cowardice wearing protection's clothing, and you paid the price for a fear that was never yours to carry. That's an honest answer, at least. It's the only kind I have left to give you, I think. I've spent too long offering the other kind. Sophie was quiet for a moment. I'm not going to pretend 20 years fixes itself in one phone call. I wouldn't ask you to pretend that. But I'd like to try. Slowly, like you said. Her voice softened just slightly. I saw the way you talked about her in that clip, Dad. I don't think I've ever heard you talk about anything that way. Not even Mom, if I'm honest. They spoke for nearly an hour. Nothing was resolved in a single conversation, but before hanging up, Sophie asked quietly, "Can I meet her, Claire?" Julian felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in weeks. "Yes," he said. "I'd like that very much." Their first meeting took place at a quiet restaurant just outside town. Claire arrived early and spent the better part of 20 minutes rearranging her silverware out of nerves she would later admit to. Sophie arrived a few minutes late, sharp-eyed and cautious, with Julian's same watchful expression. "It's good to meet you," Claire said simply, without ceremony. "No speeches," Sophie observed, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "That helps." Conversation was awkward through the first course, careful and testing. Sophie asked pointed questions about how Claire and Julian had met, and Claire answered plainly, without embellishment, including the part where she had refused his offer twice before accepting it as a loan. "That sounds like him," Sophie said, something wry creeping into her voice. "He does everything the hard way, on principle." "I noticed," Claire said. "It's a little exhausting, honestly. You should have seen him try to teach me to sail when I was younger. Wouldn't let me use the motor once, not even when I was clearly about to capsize us both." "I stand by that decision," Julian said. "You needed to learn the wind, not the throttle." "I needed to not fall in the harbor in October," Sophie said. And Claire laughed outright, surprising herself with how easily it came. The conversation loosened gradually after that, drifting from sailing lessons to Sophie's work at a law firm 2 towns over, to Claire's ongoing campaign to convince the Ashworth Coastal Properties cafeteria to serve something other than the same 3 sandwiches on rotation. By dessert, Sophie was laughing at one of Claire's stories about a memorably difficult customer at Dawson's Market, and Julian sat back and watched the 2 most important women left in his life find their own careful footing with each other, without any need for him to smooth the path between them. A different kind of trouble arrived not long afterward, in the form of a man named Gerald Finch, a freelance photographer who had spent the better part of a month trailing Julian's car with a long lens, hoping for exactly the sort of story that had already made the local papers once. What Finch found instead, quite by accident, was a night when Julian had lost track of the hour helping move a fallen tree branch off the coast road after a storm, lifting timber that should have required at least 3 grown men and a winch. Finch had photographs, blurred but unmistakable if examined closely enough, and a theory he intended to sell to the highest bidder unless Julian paid considerably more to make the theory disappear. Marcus brought the matter to Julian's study late one evening, expression grim. "He's not asking for much, comparatively, a modest sum and his silence. And if I pay him," Julian said, "what happens the next time he needs money?" He asks again. "Then paying accomplishes nothing except teaching him that extortion works." Claire, who had been reading in the corner chair, set her book down. "What if we don't hide from it at all?" Both men turned to look at her. "You spent your whole shareholder meeting telling reporters you weren't going to let people's opinions dictate your life anymore," Claire said. "So don't start now, over a blurry photograph of you lifting a tree branch. Let Marcus tell him plainly that Ashworth Coastal Properties has excellent legal counsel and no interest in negotiating with threats. And if he publishes his blurry photograph and his theory, let him publish it. Most people will assume it's a poorly lit photograph of a man having an unusually good night at the gym." Julian looked at her for a long moment, something like admiration moving across his face. "You'd make it sound remarkably simple. It usually is, once you stop being afraid of it," Claire said. Marcus delivered the message the following morning, calm and unhurried, along with a polite but unambiguous mention of the several statutes Finch would be violating by publishing unauthorized photographs taken from a public road with a telephoto lens intended for surveillance. Finch never published anything. Within a week, the photographs had apparently found their way into a folder he never opened again, and the matter closed itself as quietly as it had opened. Around a year after that Saturday morning at Sweetleaf Bakery, Ruth's health began, slowly and then less slowly, to decline. There was no single emergency, no dramatic collapse, only a gradual dimming, the kind that Claire recognized long before any doctor confirmed it aloud. Julian arranged for the best physicians along the coast, but he understood, better than most, that money could slow very little in the end. One evening, while Claire washed dishes in the next room, Ruth asked Julian to sit beside her chair by the window. "You still love her," she said. Not a question this time either, simply a fact laid gently on the table between them. "More than I have loved anything in centuries," Julian said. Ruth smiled, faint but genuine. "Good, that's all I needed to hear." She reached for his hand, her grip weaker now than it had been at the kitchen table months before, but no less certain. "I won't ask you to promise me forever. Forever isn't a thing people my age get to ask for." "Ruth, let me finish." Her eyes, sharp even now, held his. "Promise me you'll stay for her on the days it's hard. Not the easy days. Anyone can manage those." "I will," Julian said, "for as many of her days as she'll have me." Ruth passed peacefully, several weeks later, at home, surrounded by the people who loved her, in the apartment above the hardware store, where she had raised a granddaughter mostly alone, and never once complained about the cost of it. Julian stayed close through the difficult weeks that followed. He did not try to explain grief to Claire, because 600 years had taught him that grief was rarely a problem waiting to be solved. He simply stayed. He handled the paperwork Claire could not bring herself to look at. He sat beside her in silence when silence was what she needed, and he learned, badly and with considerable practice, how to cook the simple meals Ruth used to make. In the last weeks, before she passed, Ruth had grown too tired most days to sit up for long, and Julian took to reading to her in the evenings while Claire finished her shift, mostly old paperback mysteries pulled from the library's discard shelf. She fell asleep before the end of a chapter more often than not, and he never minded, content to sit in the low lamplight and mark her place with a folded scrap of paper for the following evening. One night she woke partway through a page and found him still there, watching the slow rise and fall of her breathing, with the patient attentiveness of a man who understood, better than almost anyone alive, exactly how precious an ordinary breath could be. "You don't have to stay every night," she murmured, only half awake. "I know," Julian said. "I want to." "Good answer," Ruth said, and drifted back to sleep before he could respond, a small smile still resting on her face. Several months after that, Julian brought Claire back to Sweetleaf Bakery on an ordinary Saturday morning. She walked in expecting nothing more than coffee, and found Sophie already seated at a corner table, along with Marcus, both watching the door with poorly concealed anticipation. "What's happening?" Claire asked, stopping just inside the entrance. Julian stood near the counter, exactly where he had stood the first time he'd seen her. "This bakery has become somewhat dangerous for you," he said. "It changed my life once already," Claire said slowly. "I bought a cake, I met you." "You canceled a cake," Julian corrected gently. "I insisted on paying for it anyway. I remember." She glanced toward the corner table, where Sophie was failing entirely to hide her smile. "You prepared a speech, didn't you?" "I did. Please keep it short. I'll do my best." Julian crossed the small shop and took a ring from his coat pocket. Claire's hand rose to cover her mouth. "I spent a very long time believing that forever was something to be endured, one century after another, alone by design. Then you walked into my life over a lavender birthday cake and taught me that a life is built from ordinary days rather than distant ones. Mornings at the market, dinners with your grandmother, second chances with my daughter." He met her eyes. "I want all of those ordinary days with you for exactly as many as were given. Will you marry me?" Claire laughed through tears that had already started falling. That was still technically a speech. "Unfortunately, yes," she said. "Yes, of course, yes." They married the following spring in a small stone chapel outside Millstone Harbor, fewer than 50 guests in attendance. Julian's usual social circle found the guest list bewilderingly modest, several of them privately assuming an oversight rather than a choice. He found that he no longer cared in the slightest what they thought of it. Sophie stood beside Claire throughout the ceremony, radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the dress and everything to do with the years of distance, finally closing between father and daughter. Marcus stood beside Julian, having waited nearly 2 decades to see his employer choose a life instead of merely managing one, and did not bother hiding how visibly moved he was by the sight of it. Priya sat in the second row, dabbing at her eyes with a cocktail napkin, and loudly insisting to her neighbor that she was not crying, she simply had something in both eyes at once. The ceremony itself was brief and plainly spoken, no elaborate vows, only the two of them promising in their own ordinary words to stay through whatever ordinary and extraordinary days came next. Afterward, on the lawn outside the chapel, someone produced a folding table crowded with simple food, roasted vegetables and fresh bread, not unlike the meal Ruth had once had served him at her kitchen table. And Julian understood, watching Claire laugh with her friends in the fading light, that this small gathering held more genuine warmth than every gala he had attended across the previous 3 decades combined. He thought, standing there, of his mother in her small kitchen centuries before, mixing batter by hand because that was the only cake within reach, and understood at last that she had never been settling for less. She had simply understood, long before he did, that the size of a celebration mattered far less than the hands that built it. Not long after the wedding, Julian sold Ashworth Manor, to the quiet astonishment of nearly everyone in town, and bought a smaller house closer to the harbor, one with enough rooms for a family, but nowhere near 14 of them. Marcus became chief executive of Ashworth Coastal Properties, freeing Julian to spend far fewer hours behind a desk. Claire eventually built a program at the company to help people returning to work after long stretches spent caring for aging relatives, drawing directly from everything she had learned caring for Ruth. 5 years after that Saturday morning at Sweetleaf Bakery, Claire stood in their kitchen slicing strawberries, while Sophie argued cheerfully on the phone with a colleague in the next room. Julian stood near the window, watching the harbor, and Claire glanced over at him. "You're smiling," she said. "I'm allowed to." She opened a drawer and found, tucked beneath a stack of dish towels, the small folded payment schedule she had written out on a coffee shop napkin years and years ago now, its creases gone soft with time. "I kept this," she said. Julian crossed the kitchen and looked at it over her shoulder. "You never once used it. I intended to. You brought me strawberries and yogurt instead." "That was a strategic decision on my part," Claire said, and Julian laughed, low and easy, the sound of a man who had finally, after 6 centuries, found somewhere worth staying. Sophie stuck her head into the kitchen a moment later, phone still in hand. "I'm bringing someone to dinner on Sunday," she announced, with the deliberate casualness of someone who has rehearsed a sentence several times. "His name is Marcus's nephew, actually, which I promise is less strange than it sounds." "It sounds fairly strange," Claire said. "It's a small town," Sophie said, unbothered, and disappeared back down the hallway, already laughing at something on her phone. Julian shook his head slowly. "I once ruled a kingdom with fewer complications than this household." "You didn't have strawberries in that kingdom," Claire said. "That was clearly your mistake." Later that evening, after the dishes were done and the house had gone quiet, Julian stood on the back porch watching the last light fade over the water, the way he had stood at the edge of the manor grounds on 100 other evenings across 6 centuries, alone with nothing but tide and memory for company. Claire came out and leaned against the railing beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How different this is," he said. "Standing here, I mean. I used to come to the water at the end of a day to remind myself that time moves whether I want it to or not, that everyone eventually leaves, that staying still was the only sensible response to that fact." He glanced at her. "Now I come out here because you're usually a few steps behind me, and I like watching you catch up." Claire slipped her arm through his. "Sentimental for a 600-year-old man. I've had considerable practice failing to feel things properly," Julian said. "I'm making up for lost time." They stood there a while longer, the harbor lights coming up one by one against the darkening water, neither of them in any particular hurry to go back inside. Closing reflection. I think often about how close that whole story came to never happening at all. Claire nearly walked out of that bakery with her deposit back and nothing else, and Julian nearly let her go, because standing still and staying uninvolved had kept him safe for 600 years. And safety is a very convincing argument right up until the moment you realize what it's cost you. I have come to believe that most of the good things in a long life arrive disguised as small, forgettable moments. A cake nobody could quite afford, a folded payment schedule written on a napkin, a grandmother offering a second bowl of soup to a stranger she had already decided to trust. None of it looked, in the moment, like the beginning of anything important. It rarely does. What moves me most about Julian isn't his age, or his fortune, or even the quiet strangeness of what he is. It's that a man who had every reason to stop opening himself to loss, who had watched centuries of people he loved grow old and leave him behind one by one, chose to do it again anyway, fully aware of how it would end. He knew Claire would age, and he would not. He knew Ruth's time was already short when he first sat across from her at that crowded little kitchen table. He chose the relationship regardless, because he had finally understood something that takes most of us far too long to learn ourselves. That the certainty of an ending is not a good enough reason to refuse the middle. I think about my own grandmother sometimes, reading this story back. About the ordinary Tuesdays I didn't think to treasure while I had them, because they seemed like they would simply keep coming. They don't keep coming. That's the part nobody tells you clearly enough while there's still time to do anything useful with the information. Ruth Bennett got to see her granddaughter loved well before she passed, and I think that, more than any cake or any inheritance, was the real gift Julian gave that family. Not money, not security, though he gave those too, but presence, attention. The plain decision to show up on ordinary evenings when nothing dramatic was happening at all. If you take one thing from Claire and Julian's story, let it be this. Stop waiting for forever to feel safe before you let yourself love the people in front of you. Forever was never actually on offer. Not for any of us, immortal or otherwise. What's on offer is today, and maybe tomorrow, and if you're fortunate, a long string of ordinary days stitched together into something that, looking back, will feel exactly like everything.